As the marker signal continued to seep deeper and deeper into the very genetics of a person, those who resisted or dropped made very little difference in terms of the ultimate outcome. The influence of the Brethren Moons as they corrupt and absorb a species would be beyond typically what any creature in the past could outpace, and humanity would prove to be no different. Considering humans owed their very existence to the black marker touching down on Earth 65 million years previously, which eradicated the dinosaurs, it would make a lot of sense as to why the markers would be able to thwart the human mind in its attempts to stay in its bipedal form, because the marker is directly related to the formation and evolution of the mammalian species in the first place. As Isaac gets to the ship to make his repairs, it would become apparent fairly early on why the ship went completely dark. As it becomes a continuous knockdown drag-out fight for survival, the marker would still be working in the background, manipulating genetics, growing tissue and bone, all to serve the purpose of hyper-adapting the bodies that it recently influenced in order to make them more effective at hunting down any survivors and breaking through defenses of anything that may have been constructed. It would become apparent, however, that given the environment that humanity had built, the approach would need to be a little different. Unlike the Tau Volantians in Dead Space 3, who even after what we could realistically hypothesize has been millions of years later, they do not appear different from their original forms, instead taking on some enhanced form with the darker coloring that is present all throughout the series confirming the manipulation of the marker. They would in general remain similar to their original species morphology, but humanity appeared to be somewhat different because we're just kind of cool guys like that. During the early stages of the outbreak, I think I may have mentioned this, but you kind of just have your standard person going absolutely ham on everyone. The marker will affect the actual visual processing center of the brain quite readily, and upon doing so, this will result in violent hallucinations where the person will fully believe that they are surrounded by monsters launching an attack on them. As they fight, they may come out of it at a certain point only to realize that those necromorphs that they were dismembering were just regular people trying to stop them, but in their fight for survival, their natural processes such as fear caused a ton of adrenaline to be just dumped into their bloodstream, which would cause them to overpower others more easily, creating biomass for the marker to reanimate. Time would pass where ultimately the earliest forms of necromorph would arrive. Well, offensive necromorph, because the absolute earliest form appears to be possibly the corruption, but we'll have to do a remake video on that down the road, and then their non-offensive early version would be the infector, but that appears to only arrive at certain points given very specific circumstances. The original form that shows up, and would likely be the only necessary form if humanity hadn't progressed to the point of space travel and large open areas, would be the slasher. But the slasher would have some pretty severe limitations. In open spaces, the slasher is fairly slow, even when running at you full speed with its scythe blades. Because of the alterations made to its body, its walk is fairly ungainly as it's off balance, and it moves in a way that instantly catches your attention because it's quite tall and easily spotted. Essentially, while absolutely lethal, the reality of this outbreak, if it only contained slashers, humanity would fare a lot better against these creatures, which would present an issue for the Brethren Moons, as this would allow for the few who they would actually know, due to the fact that there was several species already assimilated, there were outliers who would be resistant to the effects of the marker, or even outright immune, and able to produce a field of influence that would in turn allow others to maintain their brain's normal operation status. So, a new form would be needed in order to finally subdue humanity. This version would need to be faster, able to stalk in zero-G environments given that humanity was already spacefaring, and need to move in a way that would not attract too much attention given the fact that humans are predators and things moving in our field of view would be immediately picked up and likely determined by our brains fairly easily that this was a threat. Enter the Leaper Necromorph, a secondary genetic aberration resulting from potentially a highly damaged person, or even potentially a complete answer for the issues with the original slasher. So in today's episode, let's discuss the Leapers from Dead Space Remake, as well as a short dive into the physiological differences concerning Dead Space 3's Leaper, and figure out what makes this creature just absolutely lethal. The Leaper Necromorph, as mentioned, is an adaptation to several issues presented in the standard slasher. A quick refresher on how this can happen for all those unaware or just don't remember. Going back to the marker itself, you can kind of think of it as energy that every nerd on Titan Station tries to harvest, and really a species, if they found this thing, would exist and then think, oh, well, there's free energy coming off of it, so it must be a good thing. Acting like anglerfish don't exist, and then just put light out there to attract prey. This energy that was assumed to be used to power things like our society really appears to be energy that tries to replace your metabolism. At its core, this energy upon you dropping will keep your cells alive when your Krebs cycle ceases to function because you're either losing too much blood or there is simply no oxygen getting to your cells. The Krebs cycle energy produced, also just for your information, is the process of your aerobic respiration, and this is going to produce adenosine triphosphate or ATP that we need to survive and function. It's basically energy currency for the cell. With this cycle broken, even the cell will no longer be so much dictated to move and function by direction of internal processes, but by the external influence of the marker signal itself. With the cell firmly in control of the marker, depending on the area where you drop and who you're with, this could result in a few alterations to the original meat suit. If you drop in a fairly normal area, such as like a locker room, a hallway, or a tram station, and you are a standard human size that you were prior, and you really haven't been turned into mincemeat by like a brute, or haven't been cut in half by something else, your chances of turning into a slasher based on your surrounding environment and the requirements therein are fairly high. However, should you drop in, say, a 0G environment and it requires you to have like a grasping ability, or potentially you had your legs damaged in some way, then the chances of altering into a Leaper become dramatically higher. As we take a look at the physiology of the Leaper, it becomes apparent that there is more going on with this creature than you could like initially just chalk up to a random chance of formation. The Leaper appears to be a direct answer to the environment or damages its body received, and it's fairly prevalent, interestingly enough, in space environments or areas plagued with low gravity. But before understanding genetically why it may have turned out the way that it did, we must first take a look at its morphology, as it will give us clues as to why it became this. Starting with the tail.
Oh no, he didn't.
We see several interesting things, but first, let's get started with the barbed protrusion. The barb is not what you think it is. In the original Dead Space, it could be assumed that the tail was actually the remnants of the tarsal bones of the feet that had fused together to form this mass of bone. And it made sense too, because going up the tail, you could see the muscle fibers still looked somewhat like the original legs. But these had very clearly changed to become more light, and the bones of the leg had been altered heavily, with the femurs, tibia, and fibula having likely broken or just been completely reabsorbed by the body in order to allow for the tail to move with fluidity that it was capable of. However, in the remake, this has changed entirely, which is why I now believe it is more based on injury and an adaptation to that injury. As we look at the tail, we see it hints towards this. First, that the spinal column continues through the entirety of the tail to the barb. Because of this, the Leaper was very likely horrendously injured as a person who then lost their legs, which, considering what the hunter does to you if it catches you, it seems pretty par for the course. Because of this, they would have just been an abdomen, a thoracic region, arms, and a head. The necromorph body would have to compensate for this issue by lengthening the spinal column, which we can see as all the vertebrae continue to run down. The barb itself is now the altered and somewhat elongated form of the sacrum bone. The sacrum bone is the shield-shaped bony structure located at the base of the lumbar vertebrae, which, if you take a look at the vertebrae just above the proposed sacrum bone, the vertebrae here are clearly lumbar vertebrae. Because if you didn't know, depending on which area of the spine you're looking at, the vertebrae will take on different appearances as they have different jobs. The cervical spine, or cervical vertebrae for instance, needs a high amount of mobility to move the head, but at the cost of strength and stability. The thoracic spine needs much less mobility and instead is more rigid to help the rib cage remain sturdy to protect the internal organs. And the lumbar needs to be able to twist and lean forward and backwards to a degree, but needs to be stronger in order to support the rest of the body. The sacrum you can sort of view as just a leftover trait, which according to the theory of evolution used to be our tails. Which we'll get into this momentarily as to why this formed, but the sharp end point would be the coccyx, or the tailbone itself, lengthened in order to form a stabbing protrusion to induce bleeding. The muscle used to help stabilize the pelvis appears to have moved down to help bolster the area of the tail that connects to the abdomen, but flanking either side of the vertebrae are the spinal erector muscles that are going to continue to allow this area to move at will. Now, I did notice while I was looking at this creature that it may be possible that the legs themselves have fused together to help also give the vertebrae something to sort of latch onto, because if you look about mid-tail, you'll see a band there that appears like it could be the patella, but I'm not 100% sure, as this would make the tail larger than it is if the legs did fuse in, but this did kind of catch my attention. As we move up to the abdomen area, we see the skin here is not looking so hot, but what I find most interesting is the lack of stabilizing arms that we typically see on slashers as a counter to like having their legs taken out, and this is not present in the Leaper Necromorph. The front areas of the abdomen and thoracic region remain largely unchanged. However, abrasional damage is probably going to be common. On the back of these creatures, however, it has changed quite dramatically. The thoracic spine, as mentioned, has increased to 2 to 3 times its original length, with the thoracic spine going well past where the pelvis connection would have been on a normal human. Because of this, we can assume that when the chest moves, this would be like moving the tail with the same degree or at least a similar application of neuronal communication. The vertebrae themselves have been lengthened to almost spike-like protrusions, which can protect the Leaper should anything jump on its back, which, I don't know about you, but I probably wouldn't be jumping on that thing's back unless it was a last resort. The skin, as a result of this growth, has been broken through and is highly damaged. But then again, most skin on necromorphs is highly damaged. The shoulders are still in their original form and operate at a normal capacity that the person once had. You get some slashers who's very clear that their shoulder joints have just been snapped, but with this Leaper in particular, it's going to run in the same range of motion. However, given that the plasma cutter does have issues breaking through the connective tissue and bone, I can only assume that the shoulder joints have been strengthened, as usually a single hit is kind of enough to just cut through a human limb, given audio logs that have been found. Also, it should be noted that in their enhanced form, this is even stronger, and the connective tissue over the joint is going to be thicker, which means you have to hit it more. The humerus bone of the upper arms has seemingly not been lengthened all that much, but what is interesting is the length of the elbow. The elbow of this creature comes to a sharp point as the bone has clearly been elongated to a degree, which will be the whole theme for the entire forearm. The radius and ulnar bone have been lengthened to about 1.5 times their original length, and this allows for the Leaper to have more leverage. Due to the size increase, when leaping, this allows for it to use it as a literal lever, launching it towards its intended prey. In 1G environments, this may be only a few feet, but in 0G environments, it can propel itself across the rooms at like a massive speed, allowing it to run into someone with such force it can break bones, cause internal bleeding, or in general knock them unconscious, allowing for it to land on a nearby wall and then go back in for a more precise hit to change them into Team Necromorph. The hands of this creature are rather interesting as well. The middle and ring finger still face forward, with the pinky and index having elongated and taking more flanking patterns on the hand to help stabilize the Leaper when it walks. The thumb has twisted to around the back to operate as a counterpoint for the hand to lean back on, taking some of the pressure off the balls of the hand to more evenly distribute its weight. The head of the Leaper is the stuff of absolute nightmares. As we look into the changes, keep in mind that the bone growth is quite prevalent all throughout. The hair has been completely lost, the eyes are a milky white color, and as we know, sight really does not matter too much to necromorphs as they rely instead on the marker to hunt down the unaltered. The nose is still there, however, but around the middle of the face, the structuring has been absolutely obliterated. The hard palate on the top of the mouth is largely gone, but the top and bottom teeth are actually still present because if you look close enough, you can see that the bony protrusions are actually completely different than the jaw. The mandible is still there, and the top rows of teeth appear to have now helped form the fangs, essentially that come out of the mouth. These protrusions would be formed presumably from the teeth having left the jaw, or maybe just an overgrowth of the hyoid bone in the neck, which if you didn't know, this bone is actually pretty unique because it does not articulate with any other bone. These upper and lower fangs can be manipulated much like a regular jaw of a person, and this has overall left a massive gaping maw that another person's entire head can fit into. Apart from the environmental pressures placed on the Leaper to adapt or become the corruption, which it really has no preference, it's just simply a monstrous tool, a lot of this information would be housed within the genetics of a person, although those genes would be absolutely ancient. Something to remember is that while we are in our current form as humans, leftover information may still be present and could still be reactivated to have some influence over the body. For instance, my favorite genetic knowledge is that our bodies are roughly 8% ancient virus coding, and those ancient infections that were passed down from generation to generation actually still do have an impact on our body today and protect us from viruses that we may catch. With a Leaper, the marker does work with what's there, which is sort of a overkill way of doing it considering it inspired these changes to begin with in the Dead Space universe. These ancient genetics of a tail and bone growth would clearly be reactivated within the lower portion of the body to influence these changes, allowing for the tail growth. This gene specifically is the WNT-3A gene, along with some other supporting genes that inspire tail growth in humans. Even to this day, occasionally a person is born with this growth, and I mean, it could be considered a tail, and in some cases, it's actually even capable of being moved. These are usually cut off rather quickly though, as it's not typical for humans to have these, and it really has been dubbed a pathology of occult spinal dysraphism. And it should be noted, however, that the etymological basis of the human tail is not really all that clear, but some suggest that the gene inadvertently moved and jumped to a new area of the genome, causing it not to present during gestation. But that's the crux of the whole argument. This gene is still present within the body of the person who is being genetically manipulated by essentially what is an eldritch race of extra-dimensional monsters. Good lord, that was a tongue twister. Say that 5 times fast. I had to record that like 6 times. Anyways, as such, all genes that help the creature hunt and convert are back on the table. Because of this growth that gives the Leaper a massive boost to its offensive capabilities, the other area that we can see the most change in would be the bones themselves. For bone growth like this to take place, the creature is going to need a lot of energy, and it's also going to need, let's be real here, nutrition. But from what we know, the marker does provide an abundance of energy with absolutely no issue. Osseous cells will likely go into hypermitosis, and these are known as osteoblasts. Osteoblasts are responsible for the formation of bone. For entire new bone structures to form, however, this takes more than just releasing a bunch of osteoblasts into the body. New structures of mesenchyme would begin to form in the spinal column, elongating the spine, which then would be converted into actual bone by the osteoblasts once their formation was done. This initial mesenchyme formation is typically reserved for the gestational stage, at least turning into bone, but mesenchyme can still exist in adults, which would indicate that these stem cells would be undergoing rapid mitosis as well to continue forming these new structures in the body. I've stated this a lot in my Dead Space videos because of the energy received from the marker, but these creatures do not rely on energy levels like we do and are not limited in their ability to change and alter their bodies. It should be noted, however, that this would generate an insane amount of heat and likely has been done over the process of a few hours, unless you're infected directly by an infector, in which case heat just doesn't matter. You can generate as much as you like. I mean, it's just straight up yeehaw hours in there. So it would also appear that the marker has a direct effect on specifically the P53 gene, which usually represses mitosis in order to not just let cancer run rampant through your body, which then allows for the cells to live their lives deliberately and continue to grow the necromorph. This is evident when coming across the corruption, which is said to be like a cancer growing, and clearly, despite the amount of crew on the Ishimura specifically not being that many, there would not have been enough people to create this much biomass or material, yet there it is. Now, one of the interesting things about the Leapers is specifically in Dead Space 3. It may be that enough time has passed, or it may have just been happenstance, but we know that the Leapers will jump onto people specifically. This process appears to be more intentional towards an end goal, apart from just taking you out. So remember, the SCAF had everyone commit game over after they discovered what the marker was actually for, in order to keep the whole thing quiet and not jeopardize the entire species. Whoops. But when taking a look at Dead Space 3's Leaper, it appears to be 2 people fused into one. Interesting, is it not? Why are there so many different changes from at least the original Dead Space to the remake to Dead Space 3? Well, the SCAF escapades were going on for quite some time, with many soldiers taken out in the process, as there was an effort to understand their enemy, and this means that at least some of them were surviving long enough to encounter the Leapers. I believe these structural changes can be explained using a similar line of thinking to how the Brute formed or even the Tripod in Dead Space 2. A person seems to be able to form into one Leaper. During the process of its hunting, giving its ability to, take out a person, it appears that there is more to it than just dropping someone and then moving on to the next. When a Leaper jumps onto a person, if you do not have any armor covering your head, the fangs will likely go directly into your skull, immediately causing a massive hemorrhage in the brain, leading to an almost instantaneous end due to trauma to the frontal lobe and blood loss. It's also possible that the pincers will then enter the ocular cavity directly, piercing the thin bone behind the eyes, leading to a lot of the same issues as discussed. When wearing armor, the Leaper may have a more difficult time, but given the strength that it possesses, it can still pierce armor, or at minimum, it may be able to get a hold of the underside of the helmet, and then in a jerking motion, just completely remove the head of the person inside of the helmet. Which arguably is worse, because if you saw my last episode on Roanoke Tales, you know this is not an immediate end. You're still in there, alive for about 30 seconds, as long as your skull was not pierced. So this is not the end of your meat suit, however. You see, your brain stands in the way of the marker signal completely altering your body. Once that obstacle is removed, the restructuring of the body can officially take place, and this is why I believe in Dead Space 3, Leapers may be different. For instance, the fingers coming out of their face, it's likely a soldier that it was attacking was fighting with their hands. Once the head was removed, it likely lays down on the body, which it then fuses with it, creating a completely different variant of these creatures. It's a lot like Two-Face in The Thing, and this is likely what happens to Isaac after being taken out by the Leaper. But there is something to remember about humanity. Whether it be eldritch gods, saber-toothed tigers, or a looming crisis, humans are capable of some pretty wild feats of strength and mental resilience, which means it's time to show the Brother and Moons that Mama didn't raise no bitch. Known affectionately as a meat cello, Isaac will kick the Leaper off of him using his legs, because let's be real here, human legs are ridiculously strong and could easily lift and kick a Leaper as long as you got a good footing. The Leaper will then try to recuperate and start another attack, but Isaac grabs it by its tail and puts his foot on its head, separating the brain case from the meat suit. Is a really good way to start, but to be honest with you, it really doesn't do too much, and all it really is going to do is take away the Leaper's ability to bite. Jumping back, because the brain is no longer the focal point of its intelligence, as it's really piloted by the marker signal, it can still sense and essentially see the unaltered, but this damage has critically decreased its ability to take out humans. From here, once you sever the shoulder joints, the creature will not be able to move, but all you have done is really incapacitate it, and given it enough time, it can likely repair, or it will return back into biomass to be used in the next creation. Now you're probably wondering how it can actually sense you. From what we have seen in the multiplayer of Dead Space 2, it actually can sense your nervous system and how it is unaffected by the marker signal. So you can think of the marker kind of pinging your nervous system that then alerts its nervous system that you have not been changed. Well, anyhow, I want to thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed, then leaving a like would be awesome, as it helps get the video out there, and subscribing lets you know when I post. Supposedly. I don't know, hit the Notre Dame bell, because that... yeah. Nah, you ain't gonna get notified. Also, if you want to check out Leap for Literacy links, those will be in the description. It would be awesome if you feel like supporting this cause. I'll also drop my Twitter, Discord, Patreon, and Roanoke Tales channel link in the description. And speaking of patrons, I'd like to thank mine real quick. First, huge thank you to our astronaut, Death Dancer. Thank you, my man. I'd also like to thank our scientists, Chad W., Lakune, Logan Satome, and Tyson Nakanishi. Thank you guys as well. And to the rest of my patrons, I thank you, because YouTube's been sort of mid as of late. I don't know what is going on with this channel's reach, but good lord. Anyways, it doesn't matter. Having a Patreon definitely helps smooth things out, and you are greatly appreciated. All right, so that's going to do it for me. I hope everyone enjoyed, and I will see y'all in the next one.